I never intended to really become political, but I thought, no, if no one else is going to stand up, I need to stand up. The reason we call collective hysteria is that it's a sickness at the network level, not at the individual level. You end up with a morally righteous new notions. You end up with outgroups who are deemed unclean and infectious. And there's often an evolution of an infectious metaphor for the outgroup. One of the worst things that you can do is have centralized censorship, which prevents that groupthinky community from hearing any other voices. To break these sorts of things, you need to break them out of their groupthink.
Welcome to the Staying Free podcast. In this episode, I spoke with Mark Changizi, who is an evolutionary biologist and theoretical cognitive scientist. I hope I've got that title right there. Many of you will know him because he's an outspoken libertarian, and he's been one of the few people who's been an advocate for a rational response to COVID-19, or at least one of the few very prominent people and prominent scientists. We discuss all aspects of science behind the mass hysteria, and we also go into some of his personal philosophy and his experiences of censorship as well. There really are so many avenues I could have taken this conversation with Mark because he's so knowledgeable in a lot of different areas, but there's only so much you can fit into one episode. This episode was ridden with technical errors, so we actually had to record this over at least 3 or 4 different parts, but I've stitched it all together and I hope that the conversation flows all right. If you enjoy the episode, then please give it a like if you're able to do that. And if you can share the episode on social media, then that would be hugely appreciated. And if you're enjoying the podcast so far, then please do give it a 5-star rating in whichever podcast platform you're using, and make sure you subscribe for future episodes. And finally, please consider supporting the podcast by giving a tip. You can do this in 2 ways. The first is to go to the Twitter page, Staying Free Pod, and give a Bitcoin tip using the link. And the second is to follow the link in the bio to buy me a coffee, where you can give a donation there too. All donations are hugely appreciated and will go directly towards paying the costs involved with making this podcast. All right, on to the episode. Mark, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm really excited to speak to you. Before we start drilling into anything, do you want to just introduce yourself and just give people a little bit of background about how you kind of came to fame in this whole freedom community?
Yeah, I mean, as a background, I'm a mathematician, physics, sort of undergrad, PhD was math, and I was really doing that kind of stuff so I could be a cognitive scientist, sort of a theorist. I became a theorist in the areas of cognitive science and evolutionary biology. So I've got a number of books on sort of why we evolved to be the way we are, or why cultural evolution shaped writing or shaped language or shaped music such that it's designed for us. So a lot of design kinds of questions that get at why we're designed the way we are, why culture is designed for us, an emergent phenomena. And before COVID, I had started a Science Moment YouTube series on science, a short 1 minute to 3 minute kind of short little science videos that were mostly about areas of my research. And then when COVID hit, I stopped that series. I said, but I didn't know how to continue just talking about standard science, fun stuff while the world was being turned upside down. I was pretty quiet, I'd say, all things equal, only had maybe 3,000 followers on Twitter after a dozen years, despite, promoting books. I was mostly just interacting with science journalists, posting things about my research. And I hadn't really tweeted for 6 months, once a month kind of tweets. And I'm guessing half of my followers were bots because over 12 years, you accumulate a lot of bots. And then when COVID happened, March 10th was my first tweet. And I was just immediately trying to calm folks down. It just looked like a collective hysteria. It was already beginning to sweep through. And I was just pointing out the actual infection fatality rate, rather than what people seem to think it is, that they had a 5 or 10, 20% chance of dying if they got it. People were mistakenly comparing case fatality rates to infection fatality rates, which were sometimes 2 orders of magnitude different. Journalists were doing it in major articles. And in fact, even presented to the U.S. Congress or U.S. Senate, they presented that kind of false data, which was on March 11th, I believe. So and we already knew in early March, no matter whether you're looking at case fatality rate or infection fatality rate, the differences between children and adults is almost a 10,000 times difference in risk, and it's even steeper than it is for flu. So for those who are very old, it's worse than your average flu, indeed. For those who are younger than 40-ish, it starts to get a little safer than your average flu. And by the time you're kids, it was maybe 10 times safer than your average flu. Hugely disproportionate changes as you get older, which means we knew exactly who to protect, the old and or immunocompromised. And most of these people were sitting in long-term care homes. So the idea that we should shut down everybody everywhere, and even supposing that worked, which I was arguing since the beginning, no, that's not even going to work. These are that wouldn't make any sense. So I quickly realized that all the libertarians that I had kind of the public intellectuals that were more on the libertarian side were all panicky. Those on the left were panicky. Those on the conservatives were panicky. In the very beginning, I didn't know anybody that had my viewpoint that this is clearly completely irrational. None of these things that the people are mentioning, namely lockdowns and shutdowns and essential workers and so forth, makes any sense. But I couldn't find anybody really who agreed with me. I did find a few communists. Actually, in the beginning, it wasn't very left-right. Tons of people on the right were bonkers. Libertarians were bonkers. The left was bonkers. And there was communists, actually. Some of the first people on Twitter that I just stumbled into that agreed were communists. And communists, I'm a libertarian. Communists, though, you can't freeze an economy. If you freeze an economy, whether it's top-down government controlled or not, you're going to mess everything up. And so it wasn't, I would say, until a couple months later that it morphed into the left, at least in the United States. And I'd say there's large correlations for this worldwide, but not universal. There were some counterexamples like Sweden, where it's mostly the right, which became super Karen. Anyway, but the left in the United States and a lot of the world then shifted towards the COVID authoritarianism view. And those on the right then shifted more towards the a freedom-oriented view in terms of COVID. But it wasn't originally that way. It became that way, I think, through sort of group-thinky kinds of societal effects like this, not because of any kind of rational argument per se. So it had all of the hallmarks of a collective hysteria, which I hadn't really studied so much, but I've certainly done a lot of work that's related to group phenomena like that, and how groups, emergent phenomena, things happen at the level of the whole that no one particularly per se designed. And so I felt like by early March we were in a collective hysteria, and it just screamed out. It was so obvious. So that's what launched me. So I quickly gained a lot of followers because I just said, like, I've got to stand up. All the people that I looked up to just to say something smart when the world was going crazy, and you're engaging in the kinds of behaviors where suddenly people like me were deniers, we were unclean. Science journalists were denouncing me back in March and April. You're a grandmother killer. We should create an app so that if people show up in bookstores and they see your book, the app immediately says, "Don't buy his book. He's a denier." That kind of thing, and they would be public. So I became more well known politically for the first time. I never intended to really become political. I just thought it was just so much standard bullshit back and forth, left, right, all the time. It was like, but I thought, no, if no one else is going to stand up, I need to stand up.
Okay, so on that point of the collective hysteria then, when you kind of talk about this being the case before, that we've had these kind of collective hysterias, are you talking about periods in human history, or is there something kind of more in the natural world, or something more to do with your area of kind of evolutionary biology that can be observed maybe outside of humans, which kind of informs your views on collective hysteria?
Yeah, I guess I'm sure that the notions probably could extend to non-human social groups, which I do think about a lot. But in this case, I really haven't thought too much about collective hysteria in outside of humans, and I think largely it's because there's the kinds of cultural mimetic meme-like dynamics are something that's due to the cultural species, which is us, that has culture. And so we end up with a lot of these kinds of psychosocietal effects that you just don't find really except in some rudimentary sense in other social species. So there's many examples we're teeming with these sorts of things. So we have the large dangerous cases that everybody brings up, like the Nazis and or the Cultural Revolution in China, or the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And there's dozens and dozens of other kinds of cases like this where when there's democides is just general death by government, is the word. Democide refers to just governments that were involved and responsible for the deaths of many people. And genocide is just one kind of democide. So in some cases, it's targeted at particular ethnicities, in which case it's genocide. But sometimes it's it's directed at a class, or it's directed at a religion. And these aren't genocides in the strict sense, but they're still democides. These things, when they happen, they're always come with a suite of very similar kinds of dynamics. You end up with a morally righteous new notions. You end up with outgroups who are deemed unclean and infectious, metaphorically infectious, but they're treated genuinely as infectious. So that if you're friends with somebody in the outgroup, oh my God, you were dating somebody in those unclean, gross people, or whatever it is, then you now are gross as well. There's hosts and hosts of things that are found the same in all of these things, and there's often an evolution of a infectious metaphor for the outgroup. Now, in this case, for COVID, there really was an infection. So those people who were against fighting the infection were more likely to be. They were in the outgroup, and so they were more likely to be deemed as infectious because they're unvaccinated, they're not masking, they're not social distancing, and so forth. But still, so you might think, oh, it's just because they are infectious. No, these infection metaphors are co-opted in all of these sorts of circumstances, and that's what makes it easier for people to say, oh, let's just put them into camps, oh, let's just fire them, or let's just banish them, or let's just deny medical care at the hospital if they don't wear a mask or if they're not vaccinated. And I said that these are the big cases, right? These are the big cases of democides, but they happen all the time. So in little things that we don't often notice. So, in my town, there's just micro habitats of little cultures. Like there's the rich neighborhood of mostly white people in some part of our town, and the ladies there are all wearing Lululemons all day long. They never get into normal clothes. They just buy expensive Lululemons, that kind of style. And then there's other parts of town where it might be the African-American community, and they're dressing up all the time. And there's the Persian community. I'm part of the Persian community. They always are dressing up too. It's more part of their culture just to look nice. So let's just stick with the Persians. The Persians will look at the white uppity kind of crowds that you don't even care about what you look like during the day. Of course, they are caring what they look like. They just, within their community, they have this particular notion of what they think looks good. It's like, I'm not even trying and I still look this good because look, my butt is showing with Lululemon. I don't know what's going on, but there's these different little subcultures. And if you think about it, people will often in each culture talk about the other ones in a negative way. Just they'll get cliquey and they'll say, they'll use unclean words. They'll call groups of people, oh, they're like whores. They're just dressed up with long nails. They're just going to the store. Why do they dress like that, right? And then they'll start to have words like that are unclean and words come out even in these small settings where no one even gives a crap about each other. They don't even they don't care enough about each other to do anything bad to them. But these things happen at these micro uninteresting cases that happen all around us. People who like progressive music might feel that way about people who like hardcore, metal rock or something like this. They kind of just look down upon them. And so these things pervade society and crisscross at small little communities all the way to the largest communities. And the scary ones are when the entire community, it sweeps across. And when that happens, it's usually the case that the dictator that people will ultimately blame, and of course he or she does have much of the blame, but it's usually much more bottom up than people realize. It's not just some dictator that walks in and hereby takes control. Usually when a dictator walks in and takes control, it's like in one of these African countries where this week this coup happens and they install this particular dictator and he has no support from the people. The people barely even care who this week's dictator is. And not much changes in society. No one's really at risk because there is no snitches on the corner saying, "Oh, are you giving enough respect to the new leader this week?" Because no one gives a crap. Those aren't the dangerous cases of dictatorship. The dangerous cases of dictatorships is when they're swept in on the backs of a morally righteous mob, and that's what we exactly were seeing since March of 2020.
Wow. Okay. That was a really, really good explanation of everything. That answered kind of a lot of questions that I was going to have for you, actually. So let me know if I've got this right based on what you were saying. It's almost as if humans have a natural predisposition to kind of gathering in groups and to have a kind of in-group and an out-group. And most of the time it's benign, like the example that you gave with, different communities having different amounts of wealth and wearing different clothes, etc., thinking the others are dirty or unclean, or to a small degree, not that they should be banished from society, but based upon everything that happened with COVID, it's almost like the whole might of the state and this kind of propaganda machinery went into force, and it caused this natural instinct to have an in and out group to just multiply massively and to kind of go exponential. And maybe this explains some of the things that we've seen in the past with kind of Nazi Germany and Maoist China, etc.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any difference. There's differences in the icing, of course, in each of these different cases that we're imagining. And this is yet another icing. Now it's discrimination or prejudice towards those who are insufficiently, behind the safety, or whatever you want to call the safety notions, rather than being ethnicity or class or religion. But there is one qualitative difference here. In this case, because the world was all connected, it's the same old bullshit, but it could cover the whole world. And so I think one of the scariest things, if you really were paying attention and you were sitting in the West, this should have been one of the most informative and scary things that you've witnessed, because I think, even though I didn't think this, I always argued these things can happen here being the United States. I would always say it could happen here. I really never imagined it would happen worldwide, but I always say they could happen here. But I didn't. Part of me kept thinking, that's what I would say because I thought they could. But really my gut kind of said, well, cross my fingers, luckily seems to never happen here. So maybe it will never happen here. I mean, I had experienced some small thing. So I'm half Iranian. My wife is from Iran. My dad is from Iran. And in 1979, you're too young for this. But when the Iranian, when the revolution happened and the Iranians took the 400 or whatever, many dozens of hostages, and they kept them for 400 days, it became a moral, a collective hysteria in the United States as well. Suddenly Persians, Persians, they had no idea who the hell they even were. Iraq, Iran, all that part of the world was just really a black box to Americans. Suddenly Iran was the epitome of evil. And so all of the Iranian rug stores everywhere, because it's sort of a stereotypical first job for the immigrants, suddenly switched all their names to Persian rug stores, because the average American didn't know that Persian was the same thing as Iranian. So that kind of protected them. But everywhere you went, there was this new notion of evil, and it was constantly on the news for 2 years straight, 400 days, almost 1.5 years straight during the crisis. But then that just kept, that became a thing for a decade. And still lingering to this day. So I was on the other side of that then as a kid, as an 11-year-old, 9, 10, 11-year-old. And sort of you could see it all around you, just this suddenly overnight, this new notion of who an evil person, unclean person was. So I think I got some just personal experience that, in addition to my scientific background, that helped me see it early. Now, I think ultimately the reason, and this gets at a related question. Why did some people fall under the brainwashed, effectively were brainwashed and fell into the collective hysteria, and some people didn't? And I think it's not because some people are smarter. I don't think it's some people are more educated. Some of the most educated, bright people who should know about epidemiology and lockdowns and masks were the most brainwashed people. Academics seem to have been disproportionately brought into this. I think at the end of the day, it's just where you sat within the network. If you the reason that we all believe what we believe, I have 15 to 20 different sort of scientific discoveries that I'm proud of that I did. And during those discoveries, I did the data analysis, and I have the p-values and so forth. And I believe them because of science. All of the other 4 gazillion things that I believe is because other people told me stuff and I believed them. And I believed Doug, who heard it from somebody, and Doug has high reputation, and Judy had read a study, so I believe Judy. It's people in my network that have high reputation that they've accumulated by virtue of many kinds of interactions, expressive interactions with others. And in my community, I just start to believe them. So if I had sat in the typical academic community in that kind of echo chamber, I would be getting information from Doug and Judy and Wendy and my mom and all the other people in my world, all telling me, seem usually independent voices. I mean, they're not entirely independent, but there's some degree of probabilistic independence. And it's not like they're all parroting each other. But in this case, it turns out they all are all parroting each other because it had become a kind of a virality that had been sweeping through. So what usually was probabilistically independent information, and so when they agreed, it actually meant something. Now it really doesn't mean anything. But we don't modify our behavior in that way. We just hear these 12 different people or 1,200 different people saying now the same thing, an extremely implausible thing if you're from the outside. But from when you're on the inside and you're hearing them, you're like, well, that's a pretty damn good argument. They're all high reputation. And I'm hearing from all these different people. It's true. It's true that coronavirus is a disproportionately dangerous, altogether novel. It has no natural immunity. There's no seasonality. It doesn't, you can catch it all these different ways. Everything that we knew about respiratory viruses did not apply to this, even though it was called coronavirus 19, which should give some kind of, indication that it's not altogether novel. So the key is I happen to be aloof. Some people happen to be aloof, being socially aloof from those communities. And I've always, as a scientist for years, and I've written about it to my students, I've always tried to remain aloof. And I meant that for scientific reasons, creativity reasons. When you show up to conferences, I always avoided going to conferences. I would go to conferences. I was invited and paid speaker, like the keynote, but that's different from like mingling, going to that conference community for 3 days and then going to the next, where the same kind of group, the next 3 or 4 times a year, you get to know everybody in the community. Like Doug and Judy are the older ones who are really, they're so super famous and I want to be like them. And then by the time of your 30s, you're like semi-famous and these young people are like batting their eyes and the young men are like, oh, cool, there's Mark, And so you love that. That's like the best thing in the universe because you're like now somebody, and all the ideas that exist that matter are the ideas in that field. And the field that's over there, those people, they just do stupid bullshit. And over there, we have it's like those maps of New York, the maps of the earth, but from the New York City's perspective, where like Manhattan stretches and covers almost all of the earth, and the rest of the earth is sort of packed in the edges. If you've ever seen it, so like New Yorkers think of the earth that way, and people within conference communities think of their space of ideas in that way, and socially they get completely wrapped up in it. I'm a very social person. I knew I would as well. So I always avoided those sorts of things to keep myself aloof so I can move to a new field so that I can keep having good ideas as a theorist. And I think that's, it wasn't really for political reasons per se, although I've always tried to remain aloof just because I didn't want to get involved in one side or the other. And I was a libertarian. Anyway, I think that's what saved me, because if I had been in those communities, I'm just like everybody else. Given the social network that I have and the people that are high reputation within it, I believe them just like everybody believes them. And I think I would have been a super Karen, a powerful Karen. I would have been. Okay,
yeah. You did actually touch on something just there that I wanted to ask you anyway, because you mentioned earlier that you are a libertarian. I'm interested to know 2 things. First of all, whether you were a libertarian before this whole debacle happened. And second of all, if you were, do you think that actually has informed your particular take on it? Or do you think that your response to everything that happened with COVID is more informed by your work as an evolutionary biologist? Because it kind of seems evident to me that some of the scientists, and there are very few, who actually seem to have retained a kind of rational perspective on this. They seem to be conservatives, be people like yourself, or Brett Weinstein would probably be another example. And I don't see any correlation necessarily between being a scientist, but I do see a correlation between being a conservative / libertarian and believing that, our response is wrong. So I'm interested to know, how you think that your own ideas are informed and whether you think that impacts it.
Yeah, I mean, I've been libertarian ever since I was, my late teens, once I sort of figured out the term. Obviously, amongst libertarians, it ought to be the case that those who are libertarian-minded should be more likely to have ended up on the anti-lockdown, anti-mask, anti-interventions, anti-mandatory vaccinations side. That said, there were a tremendous number of libertarians and libertarian sort of the group of libertarian kind of community online that totally were against my position here. In fact, I had some communists on my side, but libertarians against my side. And a lot of the conservatives, if you look just at the first month, it was a mess. there were just a lot of these conservative famous publications had really become very Karen and had thrown civil liberties overboard because it was an emergency, right? And so I think then things shook out later, but I think that shakeout to me has less to do with the principles that guide them and more to do with how these different kinds of communities, as they begin signaling, they end up with certain kind of virtue signals, that things that they would say that would identify them as a group, and then they start to defend those views, and then things start to shift. There's sort of like a plate tectonics that happens over time due to these emergent phenomena. And I feel like it took 2 or 3 months before those plate tectonics led to a different kind of dynamics, which was more on this two-dimensional space of political positions where you have left and right, sort of characteristically left and right, with economic liberties and personal liberties. I don't know if you've seen this. It's the what you call diagram. Anyway, usually you can sort of imagine it's left, right, but really things had shifted. The left had gone down to the authoritarian position, and the right had. But that took 2 or so months. I'm not entirely convinced that it was for principled reasons that conservatives ended up over 2 or 3 months later in the vertical position. I feel like it was mostly for tribal reasons, unfortunately, and because I saw so many counterexamples at the start. So for me, I have coming at it from 2 sides. One, I had the moral constraint the entire time that we can't coerce people, even if lockdowns worked, even if masks worked, that you shouldn't be allowed to coerce people, and you shouldn't be allowed to, on the free expression side, private companies, even despite being a libertarian, they're public accommodations. Public accommodations should just, especially if you're a public square, that's your thing. You should just let people speak, unless they're promoting violence, or something like this, or involved in, organized crime. That's what you should do. And not to mention that it's, in fact, the federal government that's coordinating, admittedly to them. They're telling us they're coordinating with social media. So I had these even if these things worked, look, that's fine that they work. Let's figure out smart ways of creating ways that people are voluntarily going to do more of the kinds of behaviors that could slow spread. That's the kind of thing a smart public policy person ought to be constantly studying, is how can we get the people to do these things voluntarily, because there are moral constraints on what you're allowed to do to people. And then, of course, 2 was just the utilitarian question of, are these things going to work? And it would have been a lot more interesting philosophically if it turned out, okay, here's all these great utilitarian ideas. They would totally work, but we've got moral constraints because people have civil liberties. And it's the standard kind of issue about it wasn't even that interesting, because all of the utilitarian ideas didn't even work, even narrowly work. They didn't even slow spread, and they only cause massive harm at various, all these different kinds of levels. So it's like this is like not even an interesting standard kind of, a classical kind of argument of utilitarianism versus libertarianism. Just on utilitarian grounds alone, it completely fails.
Yeah. I mean, I've kind of mentioned this before, but it's like, if you are going to advocate that society should be shut down and everyone should, have to take a vaccine and all these kind of things, as far as I'm concerned, that the first principle of that idea, if you just extrapolate that out, why not advocate for something like forced organ donation or something like forced blood donation? As far as I'm concerned, they're all exactly on the same spectrum. They're at different points on that spectrum, but they are still all on that spectrum to some degree, because once you've said, bodily autonomy, doesn't matter, and you don't have sovereignty over your own body, the state should get to inject you, otherwise you have freedoms taken away. Why not then say everyone's got to donate blood or something? Because if you've got to donate blood, we know that probably will save lives. There's always, shortages of particular blood groups for blood donations. We know that would save lives, but I think that most rational people would agree, okay, well, we shouldn't actually do that, because even though it will save lives, we are kind of breaching a fundamental human right, i.e. that of bodily autonomy. And I would say, well, when it comes to the vaccine, mandating the vaccine is exactly that same principle is being broken in that context. And really with any of these measures, lockdowns, all these kind of things, they're all still breaching that first principle. And that's why when I have discussions about this, when we're talking about, lockdowns and masks and whatever it is, my response, I don't try to go into a discussion about the numbers, because as far as I'm concerned, even if more people have died as a result, I still think it's wrong lock down. I still think it's wrong to force vaccinations, etc. And that might sound callous, but then I would say the exact same thing for blood donations. I know more people will die if we don't mandate blood donations. If you don't have the state coming around knocking on everyone's door once a month saying you have to give blood, otherwise we take you to jail. I know that more people would survive in that scenario, but it's wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. Do you see what I'm saying? And I think that a lot of people have been lost in the details and the kind of lost in the weeds on this kind of argument or this discussion, and haven't actually kind of stepped back and said, what are our principles here? And that's what I think, going back to what I was saying before, that's what I think libertarians are capable of doing, because we think much more from first principles, from that basis. And that, I think, has kind of somewhat inoculated us, to use a pun there, from this kind of mass hysteria.
Yeah. And I'm constantly struggling with the same issue that you're saying. Is like, I often would say, look, we got to even just stop arguing the utilitarian side of these things. That doesn't matter. The issue is, even if they work, you're not allowed to do that shit. Stop. So, but it would almost be cleaner and easier to make that argument and make it nice and clean if they just worked, if the interventions worked. And you can say that. But the fact that they don't work, it's very hard to not start telling them that they don't work. But once you start telling them that they don't work, then you've entered their playing field, right? Their playing field is they work or they don't work. And if they work, then we're totally allowed to do them, right? Which is, once you've entered that playing field, you kind of implicitly are assuming that were they to work, you should be allowed to do them, which is, of course, not what we think at all. So there's not even any reason to be on that playing field. So sometimes I hit myself, why am I even entering these things? But I think you somehow have to fight them on the moral, on the deontological side, deontological referring to just the firm constraint of what they're not allowed to do. And you have to fight them on the utilitarian side as well, because they aren't libertarians. They aren't satisfied or convinced by that deontological constraint. And so as it happens, even in their own lights, in their own utilitarian lights, their own ideas fail. So it is one way of arguing against them. And so it's hard to not use that angle. But yeah.
And I also think that, something that we're seeing on the left, the kind of opposite of that, where the left is trying to kind of justify their pre-existing ideas. Whereas from obviously I'm biased being a libertarian myself, but we're kind of biased from a point of having first principles that we kind of live our lives by, etc. Whereas I think the left, they're in many ways the opposite of that. They for instance believe that, we heard this thing a lot, like if it saves one life and things like this, if it saves one life, then we should do it, etc. No matter the cost, no matter the economic cost, no matter the cost to civil liberties, etc. And it almost seems to me that this was a kind of a testing ground for, the left. And obviously I'm being kind of somewhat using kind of a broad brush here, but it's almost like I get the impression that if they advocated for saying we shouldn't lock down on it, because it's going to, we're going to throw people into poverty, for instance, or we shouldn't, be forcing, vaccinations because actually, it's wrong on this level, that level. It kind of says that they don't believe, it's almost like you're implicitly saying, I don't really believe in this collectivism that I've been advocating for so long. It's almost like I get the impression that on the left, it's like we have to advocate for collectivism, the absolute collectivist ideal, no matter what's happening. That's the thing we advocate for. And I think that there's probably a part on some of these people who they're looking at this and going, yeah, it doesn't really make sense. But if I say we shouldn't lock down for economic reasons, for instance, then I'm advocating that the economy is more important than lives, or something like that. And I think that they've had to kind of protect or defend their worldview, and rather than being rational and honest about the situation, they've kind of advocated for something which is in line with their pre-existing worldview, rather than adapting it and being more honest about the situation. Do you see what I'm saying? I don't know whether that's an impression you've got as well, or an observation you've made.
Yeah, I think something along those lines probably would explain why there's certainly a stronger correlation for the left worldwide to have fallen to the pro-COVID sort of side. We do find counterexamples. I mean, in Israel, it was the leaders on the right who seem to be, I don't know in detail their politics there, but it's the leaders on the right that were really deeply caring and pushing these interventions. And in Sweden, it's it was the left that was pushing not doing the lockdowns. They were the ones that were holding the line on holding civil liberties and not moving forward. And the Jacobian, it was Martin Kulldorff, I believe, that wrote in the Jacobian back in late 2020, arguing that, look, this is not really a worldwide left-right thing in our country. It's the left that's on the side of
True.
Because so I mean, you can tell. I don't think I can tell as good of a story as what you just did, and I share your opinion. But you can sort of tell, like, for example, amongst the stereotypical right, which I don't think characterizes many people on the right anymore. The stereotype of the right is that they're pro-economic freedom, but less pro-personal freedoms. They're more likely to put their hands, or the government hands, in the realm of personal behaviors. And so, for example, pro-life would be one case where they are, in some sense, like the zero COVID crowd, that even if it's a zygote, it trumps the rights of the mother. And so they're just very black and white about it. So you could imagine some people on there having said, well, I'm going to argue that we should also be zero COVID, because saving any lives, they could have just used that as a kind of justification, because right now it's a weird tension to say that people should have bodily autonomy. I'm arguing for bodily autonomy, but then still trying to hold a pro-life position where you're not really recognizing bodily autonomy at any stage for the mother. So I think we could have told stories if the right had fallen into the super Karen position.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. The whole pro-life, pro-choice thing. Where do you stand on that? I'm interested to know.
I to this day, I never understand. I just saw a video that sort of summarizes it. The guy was asking, 3 women were walking by, and he asked them, "Hey, are you pro-life or pro-choice?" And they go, "We're pro-choice." And then they go, "Okay, well, where do you think the line should be in terms of where, when you're allowed or not allowed?" And the ladies were like, I don't know, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 11 weeks, something like this. They all threw out numbers like this. And he goes, "Oh, actually, I call myself pro-life. And for me, the line has always been 20 weeks. In other words, he considers himself pro-life, but in fact, his line was much more flexible that he's been walking around with than these 3 women who consider themselves pro-choice. But their intuitive line for where the government should step in was actually earlier and more severe. So you end up with a lot of these people saying what they are on the basis of the team that they're already part of. And the average person has somewhat similar views. Very few people believe that truly believe that an 8.5 month old fetus is totally not a baby and it's totally okay for bodily autonomy for the mother to abort it. There's very few people there. There's some extremists that have that, but not real pro-choice people. And then there's certainly a lot of pro-life people that believe that a zygote is a baby, totally 100% like an 8.5 month fetus, and it should totally be protected, and we should actually seek. But there's very few people that say we should seek out, like, constantly test for like 1 day old pregnancies so that we can shackle these women and make sure that they bring them to term and are punished. That kind of severity there's very few people who have that view as well. Most regular people, whether they call themselves pro-life or pro-choice, are somewhere in the 8 weeks to 20 weeks realm as to when the growing life is then sufficiently along such that it begins to weigh enough against the woman's bodily autonomy. And where the hell that is, nobody knows. And it takes a really powerful theory to come up with where that would be and how that should trade off. And none of us are smart enough to know where that is. So it's just going to be in a fuzzy region. So I'm not pro-life or pro-choice. I'm kind of somewhere in the middle. And I'd love to be able to say that as a theorist, I can build this theory that would give me some better traction. But at the end of the day, I'm sure that whatever theory that I could come up with, even if it was brilliant, would still end up with all of these uncertain, parameters that we don't really know how to set exactly. And it would still end up to being probably pretty much as gray and uncertain as what we're all dealing with now.
Yeah. Fair enough. I think I'm probably in a similar boat. I find that I'm people who are kind of pro-life think that I'm, like evil for not being like absolutist on it. And then people who are pro-choice think that I'm way too kind of in line with the religious fundamentals. But I'm similar to you. Like I think that ultimately for me it's kind of based upon sentience. Like how much sentience does a fetus have? And I think at the point, and I know that this is kind of the ultimate question, is when does sentience ultimately emerge? But for me, if we can come to some kind of conclusion, and maybe everyone has a different opinion on it, at least for now, but I think that to me seems like the most logical thing to base it on, rather than, the point of conception and certainly not, the point at which someone is ready to birth a child, which there are actually people on left who have that opinion. I was actually just having a argument the other day with a guy called Gary Francione. I don't know if you've heard of this guy, but he's really big in the vegan community. And, I used to have a lot of respect for him, but his opinion is that you should be able to have an abortion up until any point in the pregnancy, which I just think is absolutely crazy for someone who is an ethical vegan and believes in, protecting life. So I had a huge argument with him. And it seems to me that some people, once again, they're not acting based upon fundamental first principles. They are actually part of a group. And for him, because he's kind of really big into a lot of this kind of radical leftist ideas, he has to advocate for that view, even though it kind of contradicts all of his other work and all of his other ideas. So, anyway, just a side point. But
I don't think it's.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I don't think he's thinking to himself, "Oh, if I don't hold this position, then it contradicts my views." I mean, that could still be a driver, but it's not that he's consciously thinking that through. A lot of times, these absurd virtue positions are selected, culturally evolved to be absurd, because what works as a membership signal within a community, if wearing a hat, and it's, I live in Miami and there's some communities there, and if wearing a hat, a shady kind of hat, were the signal for our community, it wouldn't work, because everybody's wearing hats because it's hot outside and we all want to wear shady, hats that help shade us. What works as a signal in terms also a position, the kind of things that you utter to show that you're a member, are the things that no one else would say because they're kind of crazy. They're kind of really out there. And so those will be the sentences or the positions that are selected for over time, because if you start saying stuff that other people start saying, they'll be selected against. They don't work as membership signals. The ones that work as membership signals are the extreme statements. And then the community will evolve over time. People will come up with reasons for why those absurd, crazier things are true. And the people with better arguments that justify them, it's like, yeah, actually, that is true because, and they'll come up with some kind of narrative that defends it. That provides a stronger base for that. And that gets further, that will be encouraged over time to get more and more stories that defend the absurd position. So it sort of self-reinforces, and the other community will do the opposite. So they'll end up with the opposite absurd positions because that helps further separate themselves from their opponents. So these things are selected for. Absurd positions are there on purpose in some sense, not in anybody's head, but as a result of the evolutionary dynamics.
Wow, that was a really, really great explanation. So yeah, that's definitely kind of expanded my thinking about the issue. Just going back again then to the COVID stuff. I'm just going to kind of rapid fire a couple of things to get your thoughts on them, because, I have heard you articulate in a couple of other interviews your thoughts on them. And I think that you did a really, really good job. So first of all is the PCR testing. What's going on there? And, should we be trusting PCR as a method of testing at all? What do you think around that issue?
I can only parrot back things that I've read about others. Anything virology and PCR kind of tests is not my bag at all. So, I know the same things that you do in that, but I don't have anything really special to say. We know that they were, pulled down as of late 2021 in the United States. There was lawsuits that then required that the government pulled them down as a test that can be done because they weren't, in fact, diagnostic of whether you really had COVID at those number of repetitions of the test and so forth. But yeah, I don't have any deep insights there.
Okay. This one probably might be a little bit out of your area as well, but do you think that the virus could have come from the lab in Wuhan, or do you? I guess maybe it's not entirely out of your area, because you might have some insight as to whether it is likely or reasonable for this virus to have kind of come from bats? Do you have any insight around that?
In terms of whether bats, I certainly know. I mean, up until recently, I had been thinking that clearly the most plausible hypothesis that came from a lab in Wuhan, that was under the assumption that there really was some argument that the earliest cases were found in the Wuhan area. Since then, over the last couple of months, I've read articles saying that like now there's evidence that goes back long before the supposed first cases in Wuhan. We have evidence of it being already worldwide, hither and thither, way before those supposed first cases. And if that's the case, then the fact that people measured in Wuhan that happened to be next to every this was already spread way before then. So in which case, then that makes Wuhan much less interesting. There's nothing special about Wuhan at all. In which case, it could have just been organic, just happened to be spreading over time from 2018 or so. And later, people happened to first measure it in Wuhan. Maybe they started measuring there because they were worried about the lab being nearby, but it's not having any causal. So at this point, I just don't know. Okay,
great. And masks. I'm interested to get your take on masks, kind of just as a phenomenon generally, because for me personally, aside from they feel like a strange kind of just something you would see in history, in the history books, and think, you know, how crazy is that? It reminds me almost a little bit of, you know, during the Great Plague, where you see people wearing these kind of weird beak-like things, and I think they called them quacks, and they had like a bunch of herbs and spices in them. And I think that history will view masks in the same way. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. I mean, this is one reason I was focusing on virtue positions a minute ago, because it comes up for all of these issues in COVID as well. So you might ask yourself, how is it that in March and prior to March, in April and even May, the science told us that masks definitely don't work and there's no reason to wear them? Historically, surgeons never, ever wore masks to slow respiratory viruses. They were only worn to stop spittle, which is always bacterial ridden, and to stop goop from the open wound from getting in your nose or mouth. They were never to stop viruses. When doctors would meet with their patients before the surgery, they would never wear their masks. It's not about protecting others from respiratory viruses at all. So suddenly then by May or June, suddenly it became that masks really work. So this kind of, the way that this dynamics works is that there were a small number of people who were more on the COVID cult side in May and April, maybe even back, who would start to wear a mask. And that provided a very strong signal that I'm a member of the safety community, right? And it wasn't very well widespread, but that was a good virtue signal, good in the sense that it really distinguishes you from your opponents, because those who thought this was not a disproportionately dangerous virus, blah, 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 us, would never wear a mask. So that then serves as a good membership signal. And once it starts to serve as a membership, membership signal gets reinforced. More people start to wear it because it shows membership. But membership signals never just stay membership signals. Then the community wants to come up with a justification for why this membership signal isn't of our virtuous community, isn't just a membership signal, but itself is virtuous. It itself, wearing the thing. This is like ladies who are wearing Lululemon. They don't just wear that. They say, actually, it's good that we wear, and there's magazine articles, thousands of women's magazines will say, it's actually good, it's healthy for your body because it lets your legs breathe, because it's designed to let your legs breathe and you can move more freely and your day is better. But they come up with all of these kinds of post hoc stories to justify why the things that they arbitrarily do because of the movements of their community and the membership signals of their community, they come up with post hoc justifications after the fact. And you and I do the same individually at the individual levels. Our brains are networks of 100 billion neurons, and we only have access to 0.0001% of what the hell's going on in there. So we do amazingly complex calculations, and after the fact, we come up with post hoc explanations for what the heck we're doing, which usually have no truth at all. So a standard example that I give is I present to you two pictures of people, two ladies, let's say. Which one's more attractive? And you pick. You go, okay, this one. And then I go through, let's say, 50 of these pairs, and you pick which one is more attractive. And then afterwards, okay, that's great. Here, remember when I showed you these two pictures? You said this one was more attractive. I want you to now write down reasons for why you thought this one was more attractive. Secretly, you didn't. You thought the other one was more attractive. I'm lying to you now, right? You'll actually write down all of these reasons for why the one you did not think was more attractive is more attractive. You come up with a little bullshit story, making it up after the fact. Communities do this as well. So now the community is being rewarded. So when someone in the Karen COVID cult community comes up with reasons and they do some mannequin study or they're making these kinds of arguments or Swiss cheese bullshit, they get rewarded with reputation for doing that, and then that spreads, and more justification and more narrative is added on top of it. That's because so there's this long standard story that people say, well, oh, it's totally true because of A, B, C, D, and E, because people in our community who have high reputation have all said these things. So it's no longer just a membership signal. It's actually truly virtuous in itself. And this is all a post hoc community internal explanation of this thing that happened for no good reason other than membership signal kinds of reasons. And this happens all over the place in all of these sorts of groups. So that's what happened with masks, and why they still to this day think that they totally work, despite them not thinking that they worked at all just a few months before that started. And this is just one example of gazillions that happen all the time. So, I mean, we haven't really gotten into masks. It's more of the large dynamics of, one of the first, actually the very first video, and I think we got cut off earlier. I've got a Science Moment series on YouTube talking about just aspects of science of my own research areas. And I was around episode 50 or so prior to COVID hitting. And then once COVID hit, I stopped the series. I said, I can't just keep talking about just sort of science, normal science, when the world is being turned upside down. It would be like these artists who kept doing the same kind of art pre-World War II and then during World War II, imagine they're living in Europe and they're just still doing the same kind of art. No, artists change what they're doing when the world is. So I just sat for 6 months and I was very active on social media trying to calm people the F down. But I finally clicked. I said, oh, I can continue the series because there's so much interesting cognitive, psychological, societal stuff going on. And this is actually the most interesting stuff that's happening in the world. And we're all watching it in real time. Every time you see somebody in their car with a mask on, there's a book that needs to be written to understand this kind of phenomenon. There's deep stuff going on all around us. This should be blowing our minds. So I restarted the series on around episode 50, and it's all been sort of COVID related since then. I'm on Science Moment 227 now. So a lot of these arguments, a lot of these episodes are really about exactly these kinds of psychosocietal dynamics and how societies move over time and how the reputation networks within them work, why free expression is so important in these networks, so that they can slowly troggle their way towards the truth rather than being forever and irrevocably handicapped as they are if you have censorship and so forth.
Great. How are you doing for time, by the way? Are you okay for another, say, 20 minutes?
Yeah, I'm good for another 20 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. We'll keep it to that. So, just piggybacking on what you were saying there, it kind of reminds me of that test that you get where you get a bunch of people in a room and you say which line is longer, and there's like five people and four of them are kind of in on the experiment and they're giving the wrong answer, and then it gets the fifth one and they start by giving the correct answer, and then eventually they switch. And I always wonder in those experiments, does that person actually see it differently? Like, do they actually see that the line is incorrectly because their brain is literally giving them information to say it's more important that you agree with the group right now than that you actually see the lines as they are, or whether that person is literally just lying to fit in the group? So that's one of my kind of thoughts about that experiment. And the other is, I have a theory that the people who really saw the COVID kind of hysteria for what it was, a hysteria, would pass that experiment. As in, like, let's say, I don't know what it is, but let's say 10 or 20% of people would pass the experiment and the others would all fail it. My theory is that people like yourself and me, and probably a lot of people listening to this, would be in the 20% who would actually pass, not in the 80% that fail. Wonder what you think about that.
Maybe. So the counter thought is, I don't know. I mean, one of my discoveries concerns why we see illusions generally, but this social kind of illusion that you're talking about is, I don't actually know that experiment very well. I have seen it, and I wish there surely is an answer to your question, or at least or some considerable discussion within the literature on it. And I suspect that many of them really do come to believe that they perceive it the way the others are lying to them. And my worry would be that I claim to have been aloof when COVID hit because I actually was not well embedded within certain kinds of social networks where these avalanches swept through. But in this experiment that you're describing, I would have been just as unaloof as you would have been in the experiment, as everybody would have been in the experiment, because there was it's all set up the same with a bunch of strangers, I presume, or whatever. So I'm presuming I would be equal. I mean, now I'm not equally susceptible because I'm a cognitive scientist. I've seen all these kinds of experiments. I wouldn't be very susceptible. But were it not for that, I'm worried I would have been no different, probably on average, because my aloofness outside of that lab doesn't help me when it's the same. We've set up an artificial situation where I'm just as unaloof as everybody else in the experiment.
Oh, okay, that's very humble of you. I guess I probably would suffer from the same, but I like to believe I wouldn't.
Yeah, I'd like to believe. I try to be honest with you. Oh, one thing. I'm sorry. I lost my way. I don't know. I don't want to just completely go in chaotic directions. But the reason I brought up the Science Moment series was that, the first science moment that I did once I got restarted after COVID was something I've seen so few people talk about. And it was the obvious one to me, which is that when you wear a mask, you cover your lower visual field. This is, of course, you're covering your nose and your mouth and your speech and your facial expressions, all the other things that are a little bit more obvious, which I've seen to not matter to those in the COVID call. But you're actually blocking your vision. And it's a little bit counterintuitive that you are. But one rate, if you ask yourself, why do American football players wear put black paint or whatever underneath their eyes? They put black paint underneath their eyes so that they end up with less reflection from the sun off of their skin into their eyes. But if light is reflecting directly from your cheek into your eye, it means that you see your own cheek, right? You see, in fact, this I'm saying all the time when you're walking, you see your nose. If you close one eye, you're often wiggle your nose. You kind of probably notice that you see your nose, but 99.999% of the time, you're not consciously aware of your nose. Well, the same thing is actually true for the actual end of your visual field on the bottom includes your cheeks. It often includes parts of your feet as you move forward. It includes the ground as it approaches your feet. If you actually put on a mask, any of the crappy masks that you wear, and you actually look at the first part of your visual field that you can then see, if you start to point, you'll realize that instead of pointing almost straight down, it's now considerably constrained up high. So you're missing all of this optic flow that happens in your lower visual field, which is what we use to navigate and to spatially navigate and to be amazing, acrobatic creatures that we are. So falls are a very dangerous thing. Every year there's several million falls worldwide. We've got 600,000 deaths every year from falls alone. So how many extra falls are there on the basis of this? No one ever measures. When Biden was going up the steps to the airplane 6 months ago or wherever it was and fell 2 or 3 times. Yeah, he's older in his age. He's not exactly fit anymore, but you can be sure that having the mask there is making it much harder. And this is just one important injurious side effect amongst dozens and dozens of side effects that I've been railing on about masks. And for some reason, none of these seem to matter, even if masks work, which they obviously do not work. They can't work. They never have been used to do this. And we can even explain why they believe the stuff that they do, psychosocietally, we can understand this. So, it's a great microcosm of craziness, the masks.
Yeah, really, really interesting stuff. So another thing I wanted to ask you about is the censorship that you've experienced. I know that I can't search you on Twitter. Nothing comes up. You've obviously got some kind of ghost ban there, or whatever you call it. I'm interested to know kind of what's going on, because I know that you've got a lawsuit going on, which is something to do with censorship. So, what are the details of that?
Yeah, so in 2021, I was temporarily suspended for 12 hours, and then another time for 7 days, and then another time just permanently suspended. I appealed that, and all of these were for posting published papers that were even on NIH servers. So then I appealed and I got back in at the end of 2021. But for the lawsuit, So we, with New Civil Liberties Alliance, with Michael Sanger and Daniel Kotzen and I, are suing the federal government, not suing Twitter, for First Amendment violations, because the government just has been announcing since April of 2021, hey, we're working with social media and Twitter and Facebook to make sure that the misinformers, their posts are striked and they should be kicked off. And if they're kicked off from one, they should be blacklisted across all of them. What I just said is almost verbatim what the Biden administration is actually saying. And actually, as they began that whole thing in April and May, my impressions and my number of new subscribers at YouTube, my impressions at Twitter, and the number of new subscribers at YouTube were rising and rising and rising and rising and rising all the way up until there. And then suddenly something I didn't even notice back in July or May or July when it started to fall, but they were falling and falling. And somewhere around November, I said, I'm just not getting any impressions anymore like I used to at Twitter. I'm not growing anymore. I'm not getting any new subscribers at YouTube. It's just coming in little trickles. And then I just went back and I said, what's the new number of impressions per month starting from January of 2020? And you just see it go up, and then suddenly all falls back down towards zero again. And the number of new subscribers rising at YouTube, and then all falling back. So I basically stopped rising in both places. Yeah. So many people, I'd say 30% of the people, you can't, if they try to find me at all, I don't come up. If you type in my full name, eventually, one of my old accounts, like a backup account, might show. And then at the bottom says, would you like to see more results? And you click here, then it shows my page and it says, are you sure? Because this is sensitive, totally sensitive material. And then once you're there, a lot of people each of my tweets just says, this is sensitive material. You can't see this unless you change your settings. And some people can never figure out how to change their settings to see it. So yeah, for more than a year now, I've been massively deboosted at YouTube, at Instagram as well, Facebook, and especially Twitter. And so, yeah, we're involved in a lawsuit and FOIA requests for all of these things that is ongoing.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I wish the best of luck with that lawsuit. Michael Singer, he's a lawyer, is he?
Yes.
Okay. So you've got the right guy on your team anyway.
Well, and Daniel Watson is also a lawyer.
Great. Great. Hopefully that will pan out for you. So just moving on to a couple of questions from the listeners. I know that you know that one or two of these are coming, and it's probably not going to be in your area. It's probably better to ask virologists, but I'll fire them at you, and then we'll just maybe do a quick little rapid fire on these questions, and let me know your take on all of them. So Liam Vessi, he says, why can't they isolate viruses using Koch's postulates? So I guess this is speaking to the whole germ theory versus body toxicity stuff. Do you have any take on that?
No, yeah, that's out of my Bailey wax or whatever the word is.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I am looking to get someone on to talk specifically about that. So I'll do that another time. Satirical Truth says, how does he interpret the statement from the late Dr. Luc Montagnier that the unvaccinated will save humanity and that the vaccines are causing the variants?
What was the last part of the unvaccinated?
And that the vaccines are causing the variants. So I guess this is something to do with kind of immune escape and stuff. Right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert on this. I follow this very closely, and in a number of great Substacks, including Bad Gato. There's a lot of great places, but this has not really been my thing. I felt there's been a lot of really bright data, smart scientists that have been keeping their eyes on this, and so I've been trying to focus more on where my expertise is which is more the psychosocietal level stuff, which is ultimately, I think, really what underlies all of what's going on. This isn't really about a pandemic. It's about a mass hysteria and how we need to fight it and how we need to learn from it in the future.
Okay, so the final question, and this one is probably going to be a bit more in your area of expertise. This one's from Mighty Sprite. Is it possible for people who have fallen for the COVID propaganda to see truth, or are they lost forever?
This is part of what I would say the $1 trillion question. The $1 trillion question being, how do societies protect themselves from these kinds of collective hysterias, or cure themselves from these kinds of collective hysterias, or inhibit these sorts of collective hysterias? And this is all wrapped up as part of that. One way that they can definitely be lost forever is to have the censorship, top-down censorship, centralized censorship that we've been having. The way that you break through to any community, anyone who's involved in a kind of hysteria, is you have to have the voices from the outside breaking through. And a world where there's such intolerance and centralized censorship is one where that potentially can never happen. Now, this is what in early 2021, Dr. Tim Barber and I started a research institute called the Free Expression Group, which is devoted to understanding these kinds of psychosocietal phenomena, how free expression works, how these reputation networks work, how cascades or virality can occur through them, how they can be potentially stopped. Trying to understand the math and psychology and emergent phenomena that really governs both free expression, the move towards truth, and how when it breaks, you end up with these kinds of collective hysterias, which cause all of the great democides and genocides. This doesn't just happen at the scales like we're dealing with now. Even communities like eating disorder communities, second world and third world countries don't have eating disorders like we do, like anorexia. And so there's voices within this community that I know, because I have some family members that had these sorts of issues. These communities themselves are kind of like little collective hysterias. They get to know each other online, they follow, and then they all get their own notion of righteousness, which concerns how you eat and how barely you eat and how other people are not doing it properly. And then they end up in a kind of like their own little virtuous notions of this, right? And the way that they try to solve this, the actual medical advice, is to actually send these people away from their homes and all put them together in a group, which is the worst thing that you can possibly do, because although they do, now they're members of the group and now they're all competitively signaling and trying to be the best at what they do, namely anorexia or bulimia or whatever the bullshit. And I think there's the same kinds of arguments for a lot of the trans communities, which has suddenly grown from micro percentages. Suddenly, like half of the children in some of these high schools in our areas are all claiming to be one kind of trans, not half, but like tremendous numbers. A lot of these things are social phenomena. They're not psychological per se individual. They're collective phenomena. And the way that you need to break them is to end up with voices breaking through. And those voices have to be insistent and incessant. So at the Free Expression Group, freex.group, our research, our book came out yesterday, the first sort of product of this, called Expressly Human, Decoding the Language of Emotion, which is really about the foundations of how free expression evolved to work amongst humans. And it involves emotional expressions, but also involves just the way that we talk all the time, and even in language, which is a relatively recent invention, cultural invention, is still along the same kinds of emotional channels. We may be speaking in words, but we're still doing the same kinds of compromise / negotiation communication systems that emotional expressions evolved so I may be flat in the face. I don't have to be emotional in my intonation and my voice, but even so, most of the conversations that we do on Twitter and so forth are still fundamentally the same kinds of things as emotional expressions, trying to convince others. So that book is about understanding the foundations of emotion, of how humans evolve to express one another and how that works at the network level. And more generally, our institute is really devoted to research to both understanding how narratives are formed amongst these things, how they are misformed when things don't go well, why narratives are so hard to reverse or to roll back. And they have many formal mathematical properties akin to blockchain, which is why blockchain is good, because it's really hard to roll back. If I spent Bitcoin on you, I can't then claim not to have done so, because it's in the blockchain. It's decentralized and it's something that can't be rolled back. And it turns out that narratives have a very similar property, and they need to have that property, because if I have had an argument with you, later I could say, no, I didn't totally get humiliated. It was Johnny that got totally humiliated. But it's already been decentralized by virtue of gossip in the social community that no, Mark lost reputation, Johnny gained reputation. And the way that something like proof of work, it's one of the ways that keeps it unalterable, has similar kinds of properties. When gossipers come up with a good story that explains the week's events, it's really hard to come up with a good explanatory story, really easy to verify. That's the key to how proof of work works. And also proof of stake is another thing. People with higher reputations are the people that you're going to be more likely to accept their explanations for add addition to the narrative of what happened this week. So that's a very similar kind of thing to proof of stake. Some of the same kinds of properties that we have on blockchain that makes it work in a decentralized way, we already had been doing within social communities because there is no centralized location where all of our reputations are written down on some ledger. No, it's just decentralized amongst the heads of those in the community. So anyway, that's just sort of a glimpse into the way that a theorist starts thinking about social communities and free expression and trying to understand them in such a way that we can understand why they're so hard to unravel. So when someone's part of that narrative and it's in their head, it's really hard to break out of it. So now that we get that mathematical extent, are there dissimilarities, disanalogies, such that we can, leverage that to help break out of that? Yeah. So, without deep theoretical expertise, of course, one of the worst things that you can do is have centralized censorship, which prevents that groupthinky community from hearing any other voices. It only just encourages the groupthink, and that's what we see now is not just centralized fact checkers within private companies, but also federal government coordinating with them, which is the worst thing that you can do. To break these sorts of things, you need to break them out of their groupthink. Otherwise, the sickness, which is not really at their individual brain's level, their individual brain is fine. The reason we call collective hysteria is that it's a sickness at the network level, not at the individual level. So you really have to fix them individually by mucking with the nature of the network and pulling them into your own network or breaking up their network, getting your messages into their network so they're not insulated.
Yeah, so I guess that speaks to why you're spending so much time trying to fight against censorship then, because you obviously see the censorship aspect as being somewhat of a kind of hurdle in the effort to kind of break down the hysteria, right?
Yeah, it's the intuitions of regular people are often about how to help a situation are often exactly the wrong intuition. So a lot of perfectly nice people, their first intuition is, well, there are people who are saying wrong things, so we should just have the federal government only allow people to say true things, right? That sounds like a really nice thing, but there's a level of naivety that you could say is there. But I think there's still this notion, well, misinformation. We shouldn't allow people to do misinformation, but it's completely misunderstands the nature of reality. The nature of reality is that every debate has at least one person who's wrong. Often, both people are wrong, and the way that we find the truth is through that messy, ugly debating, or people in parallel arguing, big, complicated, emotional kind of morass. That's how even science finds its way towards the truth, as well as society.
Yeah, so that's super interesting. And actually, everything you were saying there about the decentralized kind of cryptocurrencies and how they have these parallels to human nature and the dissemination of information, et cetera, and truth itself. This was actually something that was on my list of things to ask you, but I thought that it was kind of such a big topic that it almost justified its own conversation. And similarly with what you were discussing there in terms of the censorship and how that affects society, I feel like these are conversations of their own that we could probably riff on for a good 2 hours, but we have to wrap this up at some point. So before we do, I just want to give you the opportunity to kind of talk about the projects that you have. Well, I guess you've got the free expression group and also the new book coming out. So if you wouldn't mind just telling my listeners about those things.
Yeah, so I mean, the free expression group is in some sense my reaction. Rather than moving to some random research direction, I tend to move from one research area to completely different research areas because I've more of a grand unifying kind of theorist. And once I've made some discovery that I'm proud of in a field, the odds of me getting something that's equally cool in that field is effectively zero. So I've got to be free to move on to other fields. This time, though, seems like I was already poised. We were already poised, Tim Barber and I, to move into understanding at the sort of more global level, at the holistic network level, understanding these kinds of principles that can explain or cure collective hysterias and free expression, how it functions in the interaction both individually at the psychological human, one individual at the level of the whole. So the free expression group is really devoted to that. And as part of its efforts, there's writings that occur there, the science my Science Moment video series at YouTube, which is disproportionately about those very topics. Our book, which just came out yesterday, called Expressly Human, Decoding the Language of Emotion. And it's really about the origins of expression itself amongst social animals. And generally, you can find me on Twitter, which is going to be difficult because they censor me. But also, I would recommend following me at Mark Changizi, just my name, last name, .substack.com. That's someplace where I'm not censored, and almost all the stuff that really matters finds its way daily there.
Well, you've been really, really generous with your time. I hope we get the opportunity to discuss some of these other areas we didn't delve into too much in the future. But yeah, in the meantime, keep up what you're doing and keep fighting the good fight. Thanks so much for coming on.
Great to be here.